I've watched a lot of young people walk through courtroom doors believing their parents' names made them untouchable, but nothing quite prepared me for the morning Cassidy Harrove dropped into the defense chair like she was settling in for a meeting she hadn't booked and didn't plan to stay for. She wasn't nervous. She wasn't even particularly present. And when I asked her directly, when I looked at her and asked whether she believed that what she had done to a woman's 17-year restaurant in front of that woman's staff was wrong, what came out of her mouth was so dismissive, so completely disconnected from any understanding that this room had jurisdiction over her, that I knew exactly what the next 30 minutes were going to require. What happened in that courtroom proved something I have believed for 30 years on this bench. 19 years old and the daughter of a billionaire is still just another defendant in this room, and she was about to find that out in a way she would not forget. If you believe that no amount of money, no retained law firm, and no father's name places anyone above the reach of this bench, stay for every word of this story, because what happened when I told Cassidy Harrove to stop and she stopped is exactly why this courtroom exists. The file on my desk that morning described 3 charges: criminal mischief, disorderly conduct, and criminal threatening. 3 weeks old. A waterfront restaurant called the Meridian. A noise complaint from nearby diners. A floor manager who asked a table to lower its volume. What followed was not an argument, it was a performance. A service cart of glassware swept to the floor, 2 tables overturned, and when the restaurant's owner, a 54-year-old woman named Ruth Annan, who had been running that kitchen for 17 years, came out to ask the table to leave, the 19-year-old at the center of it got close enough to Ruth's face to tell her that she would have this restaurant shut down before the end of the month. Cassidy Harrove were cited at the scene. She did not apologize. She told the responding officer that her father's people would handle it, walked back to her car, and left. 3 weeks later, she walked into my courtroom. No late arrival, no theatrical entrance, just a 19-year-old in a fitted blazer who moved to the defense table the way people move through rooms they consider their own, and dropped into the chair before she had been invited to sit. Her attorney, a senior partner from the Harrove family's retained firm, a man who has been managing this family's legal inconveniences for 8 years, and who carries himself with the specific weariness of someone who knows exactly what his client is capable of and has learned you cannot stop her, leaned in and said something quietly before they settled. She did not look at him. She was already looking at the bench with the expression of someone calculating how long this was going to take. In the gallery's second row, Ruth Annan sat in a dark green blazer with her hands folded and her posture very straight. 17 years of a restaurant, 23 employees, 3 weeks of dealing with the aftermath. She was not performing distress. She had run out of the energy required to perform it. She was simply there holding herself together for exactly as long as it would take. Cassidy did not look at the gallery. She looked at this courtroom the way people look at rooms they have already decided cannot touch them. The matter was called forward. Before the charges had been read in full, Cassidy spoke. She said she would be taking care of the damages directly, and she was not entirely sure why this had required an actual court date, as though the court might simply agree there had been a miscommunication and everyone could go home. I informed her that criminal mischief and criminal threatening are not civil matters that can be resolved by a check. She said, my dad's people said this would be handled. I set my pen down. Her attorney stepped in with the prepared statement. The incident had been an overreaction to a situation mishandled by restaurant staff from the beginning. The statements made to Miss Ann were hyperbolic expressions of frustration, not genuine threats. The Harrove family was prepared to make full financial restitution for any documented property damage. He delivered all of this with the practiced smoothness of someone reading a document he has written many times in slightly different forms. I listened to every word. Then I asked my first question. Counsel, your client told Miss Annan she would have her restaurant shut down before the end of the month. That restaurant has been operating for 17 years. It employs 23 people. What would you like this court to understand about how that statement constitutes a hyperbolic expression of frustration rather than a threat? The attorney recalibrated. I did not wait for him to finish. I turned to Cassidy directly. Miss Hargrove, I want to ask you something. The woman who owns that restaurant is sitting in this room. She has been dealing with the consequences of what you did for 3 weeks. Do you believe that what you did was wrong? Cassidy looked at me for a moment. Then she said, I think the whole thing was blown out of proportion. The staff was rude to me first, and someone needed to hear that. The gallery went very still. I looked at Cassidy Hargrove for a moment before I spoke. Then I said, Miss Hargrove, I want to make something clear before we go any further. You are not in your father's building right now. You are not in your family's restaurant or your family's car or any room in your family's life where the name Harrove changes how things work. You are in this courtroom, and in this courtroom, what your father's people said or did not say about handling this does not change what you did, and it does not change what this court is going to do about it. Something crossed her face, not remorse. I want to be precise about that. What crossed her face was the specific expression of someone who has just encountered for what may be the first time in her public life a room that appears to be operating by rules she has not already negotiated around. She was recalibrating, deciding whether the room was serious. She decided to test it. She said, "You know what? I've sat here and I've been completely cooperative, and I think you need to." I raised one hand. "Miss Harrove, stop." She stopped. The courtroom was completely still. Her attorney's hands were flat on the table in front of him, not moving. He was not going to intervene. He has been in rooms with this family long enough to know when a moment has arrived that cannot be managed, and he recognized this as one of them. I looked at Cassidy. She was looking at me with the expression of someone who has just stopped mid-sentence. For the first time, she can remember and is not entirely sure how it happened. I reached for the folder. Ruth Annan had submitted a victim impact statement. I read it into the record. Ruth did not write it as a financial accounting, though the financial accounting is in it. The wine glasses, the water, the tablecloth, the cracked chair base, the 4 tables that left before their food arrived. Those numbers are in the record and they matter, but they are not what Ruth wrote the statement to say. She wrote it to describe what it feels like to watch someone destroy something you built with your own hands in front of your staff and your customers while telling you to your face that they will take the rest of it away before the month is out. 17 years, a catering operation in a leased commercial kitchen built from nothing into a waterfront restaurant with 23 people whose livelihoods depend on decisions she makes every day. She wrote about the 3 weeks since, the sleeplessness, the replaying of the moment she came out of her kitchen and saw what was happening. Then she wrote the paragraph, I will not forget, 2 of her servers. Both of them had worked at the Meridian for more than 4 years, came to her separately in the days after the incident and asked quietly whether the restaurant was really going to be shut down because they had heard, because word gets around, and she wrote about what it cost her to stand in front of each of them and answer that question, to be responsible for 23 people's livelihoods while a 19-year-old girl's threat was still sitting in the air and resolved. I read all of it without inflection and without pause and without looking up until I was done. Then I set the statement down and looked at Cassidy. Her jaw was set, her hands were on the table, but something had shifted in her expression. Not contrition, not yet, but the first hairline fracture in the performance of indifference she had been maintaining since she dropped into that chair. I picked up the sentencing file. I found Cassidy Hargrove guilty on all counts. The sentence had 5 components, and I intended each one to be understood as deliberate rather than procedural. First, a $15,000 fine, payable directly to Ruth and Ann, covering documented property damages and estimated business loss. Second, 300 hours of community service at 3 specific small businesses in this city that are applying for development grants through the city's Economic Development Office. Businesses built by people who started with nothing and are working to keep what they built. Actual shifts, actual work, hours logged and verified by the business owners directly. Third, a formal written apology to Ruth and reviewed by this court for authenticity before delivery, to be delivered in person at the Meridian in front of the staff. Fourth, mandatory completion of a conflict resolution and anger management program with documented proof of completion submitted to this court. Fifth, a 1-year suspended sentence on the criminal threatening charge to be activated in full immediately without additional hearing upon any failure to complete any single element of the sentence as ordered. Cassid's attorney argued that the sentence was disproportionate for a first offense with no prior criminal record. I said, your client swept glassware to the floor of a woman's business, overturned tables, and told a 54-year-old business owner of 17 years that she would destroy what that woman had built. This sentence is not about what your client did for the first time. It is about what she needs to understand before she does it again. The attorney sat down. Cassidy turned in her chair and looked toward the back row of the gallery. Elliot Hargrove had been in the back row since before the hearing began, a tall man sitting in the wooden gallery bench, the way people sit in places they are not accustomed to, upright and aware of the hardness of the seat. He had come without anyone from his legal team, no associate, no paralegal, no one carrying a document case, just Elliot Hargrove alone. Cassidy looked at him. He did not rise. He did not speak. He did not gesture or signal or do anything that could be interpreted as an indication that he was going to make a call or deploy any of the apparatus that had presumably been available to her every other time a room had tried to hold her to account. He nodded once, the specific nod of a man who made a decision before he walked through the doors of this courthouse and is not going to revisit it in this room. Cassidy held his gaze for a moment, then she turned back to face the bench. I offered Ruth Nan the opportunity to address the court. She stood. She was brief and she was precise. She said she had not pressed these charges to punish anyone. She had pressed them because her staff needed to see that what happened to their workplace mattered to someone outside their workplace. 23 people had watched a girl sweep their glasses to the floor and threaten the jobs they depended on. Those 23 people needed to know that the law considers that worth showing up for. That's all I came to say. Ruth said that someone showed up. She sat down. The courtroom was quiet in the way courtrooms go quiet when something has been said that does not require a response. I let the quiet stand. The fine was paid within 2 weeks directly as ordered to Ruth Annan. The conflict resolution and anger management program was enrolled in and completed within the required time frame, the 300 community service. Hours began the following month. 3 small businesses, actual shifts, actual work. The hours were logged by the business owners and submitted to the court directly. At the first business, a small independent bookkeeping and tax preparation firm, the hours were completed with the specific body language of someone serving a sentence, minimal engagement, functional compliance. At the second business, a small catering supply company, something was slightly different, less armor. Near the end of her last shift, Cassidy asked a question about how the inventory system worked. She had not been required to ask. The third business was David Park's printing and graphic design company. David is 61 years old. He started the business in his garage 22 years ago and has been running it as a sole proprietor ever since. He did not know when Cassidy arrived that she was the daughter of anyone in particular. On her final scheduled shift with a client order due the following morning that David had not finished, Cassidy stayed 2 hours past the time she was required to stay. She helped him complete the order. She did not tell anyone she had done this. The apology at the Meridian was delivered on a Tuesday morning. At 8:15 a.m., before the restaurant opened, 8 members of staff were present. The written apology had been reviewed by this court before delivery, reviewed to ensure it reflected a genuine account of what Cassidy had done and what it had cost, rather than a document designed to perform accountability, as little of it as possible. It passed review not because it was eloquent, because it was not. It was awkward and insufficient in the way that all genuine apologies are insufficient. It read like something written by someone who was trying to say a true thing and did not yet have all the words for it. Ruth Annan received it. She read it. She thanked Cassidy. Then she walked back to her kitchen because the restaurant opens at 11 mo and there was work to do. 6 months after the sentencing hearing at a family dinner, Cassidy told Elliot Harrove that she had been thinking about working in small business development. She said she had spent 8 months in rooms with people who had built things from nothing, and she found she wanted to understand how that worked. Elliot Hargrove said, "Good, start somewhere and build something." The following week, a letter arrived at the courthouse addressed to me. The return address was a printing and graphic design company on the city's east side. It was from David Park. His letter described a young woman who had arrived at his shop for community service assignment and had, over the course of her hours there, become someone he noticed, not because she was exceptional or because she performed enthusiasm, because she paid attention, because on her final scheduled shift, when he was behind on a client order due the following morning, she had stayed 2 hours past the time she was required to be there and helped him finish it. She had not mentioned it afterward. She had simply stayed, done the work, and left. He wanted me to know. I keep Ruth Ann's impact statement in the top drawer of my desk, not the financial accounting, the paragraph about the 2 servers who came to her separately and asked quietly whether the restaurant was really going to close, and what did it cost Truth to stand in front of each of them and answer that question. There is a question this bench cannot answer: whether Cassidy Hargrove will carry what she encountered in those 3 small businesses in David Park's print shop at Tenchert on a Thursday night finishing a client order for a man who started his company in his garage, or whether she will set it down somewhere and return to the room she was before she walked into mine. I cannot know that. No sentence can guarantee that. But there is a question this bench can answer. Ruth Annan's restaurant is open. 23 people are working. A client order was delivered on time because someone stayed 2 hours past the time she was required to stay and did not tell anyone. Someone showed up. The sentence was the correct sentence. That is what this bench is for. I want to say something directly to everyone watching. This Cassidy Hargrove walked into my courtroom believing her father's name had already managed this situation and her presence was a formality. What she did not account for was a 54-year-old woman in a dark green blazer who had spent 17 years building something from nothing and who came to this courtroom not for revenge, but because her staff of 23 needed to see that what happened to their workplace mattered to someone outside it, and a bench that understood that the correct sentence for this specific defendant was not punishment in the abstract but education in the specific. 3 small businesses' actual work, the specific texture of what it means to build something rather than sweep someone else's thing to the floor in an evening. This was not about punishing wealth or youth or entitlement. It was about requiring one person to be in room she had not designed with people she had not chosen doing work that needed to be done, and to stay past the time she was required to stay and to not tell anyone. Whether that changes who Cassidy Hargrove becomes, this bench cannot know. What it can confirm is that someone showed up for Ruth Ennen and her 23 employees. The answer was, yes, share this, subscribe, tell someone who needs to hear it. Ruth Ennen back in her kitchen. The Meridian open, 17 years and still.